All right, welcome everybody. Let's get ready to get started here. Audio check, 1, 2, 3. Does that sound okay to you? Okay, good. Perfect. Well, my name is Donald Fischer. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Tidelift, and I'm going to be speaking today about paying independent open source maintainers to improve cybersecurity outcomes. And this is going to include some evidence, some case studies that this works, and is an approach that I beseech you to consider the practical application of this in your organizations. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about Dave. So this is Dave, and Dave is the administrator of a regional ATM network. Bunch of regional banks, all the cash machines, et cetera. And Dave's really stressed out today because the ATM network is down and folks can't get their cash and so on. But it's going to have to stay that way for a while because Dave is an unpaid volunteer. And he just maintains the ATM network in his spare time as sort of a side gig. He works full-time at Best Buy doing PC repair. And so all those folks are going to have to wait for a little while until they get their cash because Dave's busy. It's actually the fall. It's soccer season. He's an assistant coach on his kids' soccer team, and they got a big game tonight. So this parable, you're probably thinking to yourself, this is a really stupid story. Why would we do it that way? That's obviously a ridiculous way to run an enterprise. And the strange thing is that this is actually what's true about the majority of the third-party open source that financial institutions, government agencies, and so on depend on. It's actually run by volunteers. That software is being created and maintained by volunteers. And so, this is really an important reality for folks to understand and accept. You want me to move this elsewhere? I see, okay. So, the reality is that our global software infrastructure that each of our organizations rely on, it is largely maintained by volunteers, and that's a good thing when it works well, and it does work well so much of the time. We have this commons of open source software that we can rely on, but sometimes, when we have these critical moments, it's revealed that the emperor has no clothes here. And a lot of the real issue here is that the burden is being borne by this community of volunteer, largely unpaid open source maintainers. They often started their projects to scratch an itch, as people say, as a passion, to be part of something, to have an impact. And then they got hundreds of users and thousands of users and eventually millions of downloads. And then their experience in this side activity ends up being, fielding issue requests and responding to vulnerability reports, a lot of which are these days machine-generated garbage. It becomes a major burden for these open source maintainers. And so, it's incumbent on the industry, I think, to think about how could we approach this in a more coherent way where we don't just count on Dave getting to the ATM network after soccer practice. So at Tidelift, we've been doing for a number of years structured research about this universe of independent open source maintainers. And we just put out in the last couple of weeks the 2024 edition of our Tidelift State of the Open Source Maintainer Report. To build this, we worked with, we surveyed over 400 independent open source maintainers, some of whom we work with at Tidelift, others who are unaffiliated. And today I want to share some of the key findings of that report and throw a little sunlight on this issue and also suggest some practical ways that we can partner with these independent open source maintainers to drive good outcomes. So let's start with validating this assertion that I made that most of the open source maintainers that we rely on are unpaid volunteers. So this is kind of a headline finding in our report. This has been remarkably stable kind of disappointingly so over the last 3 iterations of this survey that we've done over a multi-year period. And what we find is that 60% of the open source maintainers that respond to our survey report that they are unpaid volunteers entirely. Then there's about 12% who report that they are professional maintainers, that is basically an element of their day job that they earn most or the majority of their income from their open source work. And then 24% of the maintainers that we survey report that they're kind of somewhere in between. They're semi-professional is how they self-identify here. They earn some real meaningful income from their open source work, but it's not their full-time day job. And as we delved deeper into the experience of being an open source maintainer, we asked these folks, how does this make you feel, right? What do you specifically dislike about being an open source maintainer? And we actually heard back a lot of things here, so there's kind of a depth to this data set. But I want to focus just on the top 3 issues that open source maintainers report. So the top 3 are, 1, not being financially compensated enough. Kind of makes sense. 2, feeling underappreciated or like the work is thankless. Makes sense in the context of that experience that so many maintainers have had of just brick after brick stacking up on top of them as their project becomes more popular and is used in more widespread ways. And then number 3, third most top thing that maintainers do not like about being an open source maintainer is that the work that comes with it adds to their personal stress. So that's the lived experience of an open source maintainer. And again, I encourage you, if you're curious about these things and other topics like why do open source maintainers self-report that they do these things in the first place, check out the data that we have in this survey, which is pretty unique. Okay, so what is the consequence of these open source maintainers struggling in these ways, having these concerns? Unfortunately, the consequences can be pretty significant and can impact your business. So 60% of maintainers that we surveyed told us that because of these stresses that that they're facing, they have either already quit or come close to quitting an open source project that they are a co-maintainer of. So that's a really scary statistic. I mean, think about that in the context of your organization. If your, people, human resources department had this information that 60% of the employees were considering quitting or had quit part of their role, that would be really, really concerning. And it makes sense that open source maintainers would seek the exit sometimes like this. They get busy. They have other obligations in their lives. And so it's important to think for your organization, what would happen if some of these hundreds, thousands of open source packages that appear in your dependencies of your custom applications, if they just kind of quietly went out of maintenance? There were no more security updates, no more issues getting resolved on GitHub, no new features getting added. It tends to happen with a whimper, not with a bang, but it has real implications on your organization as that foundation kind of erodes. Okay, so it's not all bad news in the Tidelift maintainer survey, fortunately. So we do have some positive news to share. Really the most positive, optimistic headline in our research is that we found very clearly that paid open source maintainers perform many more critical security and maintenance practices around their projects than unpaid maintainers. In fact, looking across a spectrum of different secure software development practices, paid maintainers apply these practices to their projects about 55% more of the time than unpaid maintainers do. Here again, I just want to zoom in on a couple of the specific secure development practices make this concrete. So one of these is peer review. So can I get a show of hands? How many of you in your organization have a policy that before new code goes to production, 2 sets of humans lay eyes on that code and there's some form of peer review? Yeah, cool. Seen a lot of hands go up. That's a pretty basic standard, both for quality assurance, also for security discipline, right? That turns, it's a incremental defense against insider threat attacks, for example. When we look at this open source maintainer community, we asked them, do you do this for your project? And we found that only 27% of unpaid maintainers reported that they have a peer code review process with multiple fellow maintainers. That actually makes a lot of sense in this world because actually many of these projects are just single human maintainer projects. There are no peers to do the review. The good news is that when we sliced the data and looked at the maintainers that self-reported as paid, either full-time professional or semi-professional maintainers, the number jumps from 27% to 53% of those maintainers have peer review in effect on their projects. So clearly there's a correlation here that's happening. An additional secure development practice we could look at is having a defined security disclosure plan as to what happens when you're contacted about a security issue. Once again, here we find that unpaid maintainers, less than half of them report that they have a defined structured security response plan. And among the paid maintainers, 2/3 have such a plan in place. So again, evidence that there's a different set of behaviors that emerge from the paid open source maintainer community. So we've kind of established here that paid open source maintainers drive better cybersecurity hygiene, at least, in the open source projects that they look after. So the question is, how could we have more paid maintainers? And the answer is quite simple. Pay the maintainers. Go find the people that are building the software that your organization relies on and create a way to partner with them where they can earn income based on taking the work that they're already doing around the open source projects that they've generally created themselves, or at least are the current maintainers of, and leveling up their work to these enterprise-grade secure development practices that we all require in our own organizations. We can partner with the open source maintainers to do this for the upstream projects as well. And that's basically what Tidelift, my organization, is about. We have a commercial service that enables organizations to do this at scale, to partner with independent open source maintainers, agree on a set, what are those standards that we want to cause to be followed for the open source projects we rely on. We map those to industry standard frameworks, like, for example, the US government's NIST Secure Software Development Framework, or the OpenSSF Scorecard, which I'll talk about in a moment. And when these open source maintainers cause those projects to follow those practices, they attest that to Tidelift. We capture that data information, we make it available to our customers so that they can assess the health of the open source that's flowing into their applications. We provide tooling and an API to get at that data. That's basically how we connect the dots between these previously unpaid, now increasingly paid open source maintainers and organizations like yours that rely on them. So I want to turn to some specifics, bring some more data here into the conversation to demonstrate that this works. So we've been doing this for quite a number of years now at Tidelift, and I want to focus specifically on a project that we did in partnership with the OpenSSF Scorecard project and some of the large commercial contributors to that project. So in this case, starting in 2022, we engaged a pretty broad base of open source project maintainers, specifically around the secure development practices that appear in the OpenSSF Scorecard. You know, kinds of things that you would expect here if you're not familiar with OpenSSF's project. Enable multi-factor authentication on all of the systems involved in your release process. Have that defined security response plan in place. Verify who are the committers who can release your open source project, things like that. And it's basically rolled up and assessed, and each project is assigned a score. What we found is when we engaged open source maintainers and we said, hey, here's the list that we're looking to get done, we would like you to do this for your project, and we will pay you for kind of going through the brain damage of doing some of this tedious but important work. The average score, OpenSSF Scorecard, of those projects as measured by an independent third party did increase. So over the course of this project, we increased the average score of our participating cohort to 7.2 out of 10. And the average open source package score that OpenSSF measures actually declined during this period, partially because they got tougher on grading, I believe, is the main thing that happened there. So it was a bit of a moving target, but even with the grading curve getting more difficult here, significant lift to the cohort that was paid to follow these specific secure development practices. Kind of makes sense, right? But here's the evidence that demonstrates it. Looking at it from an alternative perspective, just really briefly, we've looked at this from the consumption perspective of organizations that are building with open source, and in this case, using the Tidelift service to vet the hygiene, security hygiene of the open source components that they use. And what we've seen is, here we picked an example Python application where going into an engagement with Tidelift, the team had zero visibility into the proactive health of the open source components that they were relying on. I mean, everybody, of course, you're all running some kind of a CVE scanning tool in some capacity. It would be malpractice not to at least ensure that you're not consuming known bad open source components. But when the question turns to, can you consume known good open source components? That's been a really hard question for organizations to ask. So here's an example of an organization where they went from no visibility with a couple of months of work, and work is required here. About a third of their packages, they had a complete report card that, again, is backed in this relationship with open source maintainers. At the same time, burning down their set of potentially problematic packages. And problematic can mean a lot of things beyond just has a high severity CVE vulnerability in it. It can mean things like it's falling out of maintenance, or it has a defined deprecation date that's coming up soon, so it's actually going to be end of life. These are the kinds of signals that we look at, and organizations, once they have that data, can start to burn down that technical debt or that risk that they can assess is coming. Okay, so again, the straightforward way that we get after this is by partnering with these open source maintainers. And a subtle point that we have learned works best here in this model is not to do a one-time bug bounty or run out and pick a couple of open source projects and just engage them. What we have found to be really helpful is to durably partner with these open source maintainers and provide an ongoing stream of income to basically incentivize them and to thank them for doing this work around their projects. And this is, as you all know, as consumers of this body of software, is very much a moving target, right? So one of the interesting statistics I learned in the last week or two is that of the about 6,000 open source projects that we work with, where we work with a partnered human upstream maintainer in a kind of contractual arrangement at Tidelift, among those 6,000 projects, there's about 2,300 new releases per month. So that's the degree of change that organizations are trying to navigate. So our approach again is just basically two simple elements. One is, hey, open source maintainer, we will pay you to level up your package to these specific secure development practices, and then we ask you to contractually commit to us that you will hold your project at those to those practices, and where you're providing us attestations, assurances, additional information about your project, that you will continue to do that in the future. And we found this to be a very effective model for upstream collaboration that the open source maintainers we work with also report works for them. So I want to just zoom in on a couple of specific open source maintainers that we've worked with and some of the specific scenarios that we have helped, where we've been helped improve their packages across these cybersecurity practice dimensions. So I'm going to start with a package called Jackson Databind. Is anybody out here on the receiving end of a vulnerability scanning tool and is strangely familiar with the Jackson Databind package from your alerts over the last couple of years? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the name Jackson Databind. All right. It's a really good project, but it's kind of in a hairy domain. I mean, it's doing like data bindings, it's processing all kinds of interesting data from different sources. It's kind of been lighting up the CVE dashboards for a couple of years. So we at Tidelift, we undertook to reach out to the maintainers of Jackson Databind. We started working with maintainer Tatu Salaranta. He's one of the co-maintainers of the Jackson Databind project. And I think this really gets at the heart of our approach. Rather than just working with Tatu to jump and respond to each one of the vulnerabilities as they continually came up, this kind of game of whack-a-mole that we're so familiar with, we basically said, Tatu, why don't we just try to fix the fundamental design issues in this package, right? So we actually worked with Tatu to re-architect, re-engineer some of the guts of the Jackson Databind project. He was able to do that. He reports he was able to do that because we funded the work, right? We paid him and kind of met him halfway. We're clear about what we needed. And as a result, the number of CVE vulnerabilities for coming from Jackson Databind has really trailed off. And in fact, among our commercial customers who rely on this package, it's very common as a dependency in enterprise Java applications. Some of the, one specific customer I can think of was in the process of basically re-engineering their whole internal custom application to remove this dependency, and they didn't have to do that once we went to the source and sort of fixed the whole class of problems in a manner that some of the U.S. government partners that we work with like to call secure by design. Like, let's actually fix the fundamental architecture of the software as opposed to only reacting to events as they arise. A second story of where we've worked with a maintainer through our model. So Jordan Harband is one of our most widespread maintainers. He looks after quite a few JavaScript packages in the NPM ecosystem. And a little while back, you may recall that GitHub, for good reasons and coming from a good place, started imposing new requirements on open source maintainers to enable multi-factor authentication for their packages. This is a good security hygiene approach that I agree with. Unfortunately, some maintainers didn't like it, and so specifically there was a maintainer of a widely used package called Minimist. It's like a argument parsing framework for JavaScript that appears across the board in tons of applications and tools. The maintainer of Minimist basically didn't want to do this, and he didn't have to do this because he didn't work for GitHub and he didn't work for you. So that maintainer's solution was, I'm just not going to do this anymore. I'm going to delete my GitHub account and all of the projects that are under it, right? And he actually did have some good reasons for doing this. His particular lifestyle, he didn't even have a phone. God, I wish I didn't have a phone sometimes. So it was actually a significant burden for him to use the multi-factor authentication approach, and it was kind of the last straw that tipped him out of his open source collaboration. So what we were able to do when Jordan saw this issue arising, saw the discourse around this maintainer and his desired exit, we were able to work Tidelift with GitHub and with the original maintainer and with Jordan to transition maintainership of these open source projects from the original maintainer to Jordan. And that means that these projects, they weren't just going to fall out of maintenance, they were actually going to disappear from GitHub and break your build. We were able to have an orderly transition here that sort of worked for everyone. And again, why were we able to do this? Because we had a pre-existing relationship with Jordan, known good actor. We were providing economic incentives for him to look after open source projects on behalf of our customers at Tidelift, and we basically paid him a little bit more to take on a little bit more work. It's kind of the American way. It worked out beautifully. Last one I think I'm going to talk about from an open source project collaboration specific case study, Gary Gregory. So Gary Gregory is one of the co-maintainers of Apache Commons and also Log4j. So y'all probably remember drama recently around Apache Log4j. So In the fallout from all that Log4Shell stuff, we at Tidelift, we proactively reached out to the Apache Log4j team. We actually also did some work with the Apache Foundation to make sure that we were compatible with all of their policies and their approach. So that was, we successfully found a way to work together there, where everything's in alignment. And we've been working with Gary and some of his maintainers to, once again, just fund his work to ensure that these foundational open source projects are following these specific secure development practices. And just having an income around it means that they can spend more time on these things in general. Gary actually just recently sent us this screen capture from from one of the, this is actually from the Apache Commons Lang package, I believe. It's sort of like a object introspection API thing that's widely used across tools. And you can see the spike in activity there, where the orange bars light up around 2022. And you might be asking yourself, when did we start working with Gary? That's it. I mean, this is kind of the proof is in the pudding. When there's economic support and alignment around these issues and clarity around what we're asking for, activity follows, and we get better software that we can all depend on. Gary, I mentioned before about the recurring nature of our model, and that's kind of one of the things that's new about the Tidelift approach to community engagement of these open source maintainers, and different from, still good, but kind of differently oriented one-time options like bug bounties. I think Gary put it well when he said, the recurring income piece is critical for me, at least. Just imagine what it's like to have a job with a recurring income. It makes you feel safe, secure, and confident that you can keep on doing this work and that it's not time wasted. It also lets you plan ahead, and that's one of the core things that we do with our partners is we ask them to plan ahead a little bit more and share some of that advanced planning with our customers. How long are you planning to maintain the Apache Log4j 1.x branch now that the Apache Log4j 2.x branch is out? How long are you going to be providing security updates for what kinds of issues on different branches? This kind of planning ahead part is part of what comes with the ongoing, durable, recurring income piece. So, kind of wrapping things up here, I believe that, I started with some concerning observations about the open source ecosystem that we rely on. And I think you should be concerned about some of the fundamental issues that we're confronting, especially as open source continues to grow up and scale to really be the foundation of all of our organizations and increasingly our society. But I think there's also room to be encouraged and optimistic here, because there are new ways that are arising to proactively partner with these open source creators, provide economic nudges that kind of make it easy for them to do the things that we as organizational consumers of their software really need them to do, the kinds of things that we require of internal software developers in our organizations. We can partner with open source maintainers to get after that for the open source projects that flow into our applications from without. I encourage you, if you're curious about the data, the facts, some of the things that I've cited here, check out this Tidelift State of the Open Source Maintainer report. I've got the QR code up here if you want to take a look at that. You'll get right into it. And I also want to recommend that you check out a very succinct argument that one of my co-founders at Tidelift, Louis Villa, wrote. It's basically paying the maintainers a how-to is the format of this, sort of referencing a familiar software development paradigm of documentation. And I'll just kind of close with an observation that Louis makes in this paying the maintainers how-to. He says, in our experience, open source maintainers often start their projects for non-monetary reasons, like the classic scratching an itch, or because it was their job. Their boss told them to do this thing and they were able to still release it as open source. But after they start their open source projects for whatever reason, they often continue to maintain those projects merely out of a sense of obligation. It's like, I put this out there in the world, I invited people to use it, I guess I have to keep following through and looking after that. But the burden that comes with that continues to build, and eventually it becomes too much and they can burn out and they can quit, and that's a bad outcome for organizations that rely on them. So, to put it another way, bluntly, no maintainer started their project because they love ensuring that it complies with your company's definition of enterprise secure development practices. And they definitely didn't start their project because they wanted to take on this obligation with no corresponding income for the rest of their lives. So if your company takes these issues of secure software development seriously, practices like multi-factor authentication, having defined vulnerability response protocols, et cetera, if you want to require those things of the open source that you use, that you require from your internally written software, you are leaving the realm of software downloaded for free from the internet, and you are entering the realm of economic transaction offering value for income in return. And that's basically our core argument. That's a better way, a practical way, to address this challenge in a simple mechanism that works for all of the parties involved. I'll just leave this up here if you want to check out the report or that excellent memo from Lewis about other ways to think about paying maintainers, a practical approach to doing that. I'll leave this up here, and if you're interested in this topic, we have a couple members of the Tidelift team here with me today. We'll kind of go here maybe for a little bit and then wander out into the hallway as the next presenter comes in. Thanks very much for attending today.